Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Robert Cardarelli, Executive Vice President, Analytics and Attribution with Ipsos MMA. Robert, you have the floor.
Thank you very, very much. We're very excited today to talk about this. I think this is a very relevant topic. John's going to give us a quick background on why we're here today, and then I'll jump into, where do we go and what does the future look like?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I'm super excited to be here today with you. Super proud of our partnership together. When I keep reading the trades, I keep seeing all this news about governments around the world that are looking after consumer privacy rights, and rightly so. It's been a little bit of the Wild West out there. And I'm not seeing enough of who's taking care of the marketers, right? Who's really protecting their rights to their data and their relationship with customers. And today, at least here in the US, estimated $250 billion are spent on digital advertising. And so I think time's right, and we got to start bringing this conversation up to the forefront so we can start talking about what we can do to help marketers when they get access to their data. So I'm very excited. Thank you for having me. Thank
you for joining us. And from a measurement perspective, what we're going to talk about is what are the implications? There's a lot of talk now about unified measurement and what's happening to MTA. Is MTA dead? How does it fit into the unified measurement framework? And through this partnership, which we're going to talk about today, how do we bring data together in a way that still serves the best needs of the marketer, that is still actionable and can be activated into different platforms in a way that shows transparency, gives the advertisers and the agencies, their partner agencies, control. Just as a quick background, as Ellen said, my name is Rob Cardarelli. I lead attribution and analytics here at Ipsos MMA. Just for those who are not familiar with us, we are the leading unified marketing measurement company. Marketing unified, what it means is we look at every business driver, from business operations to external factors, media and marketing. We bring it together in a way that allows us to get very strategic in how advertisers deliver their executions, and very tactical while they're in market. What decisions should they be making about audiences, about their creative, about different targeting tactics? Ipsos MMA was founded in 1989 and acquired by Ipsos in 2020 to a scale. So currently we're operating across 31 countries doing this unified measurement, enabling our clients to really understand both in market and for strategic planning how to better allocate their investments. We have significant experience across many different verticals. Here are just a few of them. And obviously a leader. We're rated as a leader in the market by an independent agency called Forrester for delivering this to our clients, both for the analytical capability as well as the consulting service that we provide. What's going to be the topic of today is how do we work with Adform? How do we think about data democratization, data availability for advertisers, and to leverage that into both a measurement framework as well as into an activation framework. I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you. So I'm the regional president of the Americas for Adform. Adform has been around since 2002, making us one of the longest fully resting players in the space of advertising technology. And having been in the AdTech space since the mid-90s, I would say that we're the only AdTech platform that's purpose-built for brands. And what I mean purpose-built for brands is our fundamental focus is on making sure that we're not building ancillary line items of business off of either data or relationships with customers by selling media or going into other type of data brokerage businesses. Instead, we're really focused on supporting the principles of advertising. And as I mentioned before, you got $250 billion spent on digital advertising every year, right? And advertisers pay for this whole ecosystem. So they need to be supported in a way through their advertising technology stack that's not just delivering the ads, but also managing the relationship with those customers. We're local in 23 different markets around the world, over 2,500 different accounts, 2,000 global clients, and we're really proud to have won a bunch of awards recently that support this conversation. And so much that we voted us best DSP in the United States. AdExchanger gave us best privacy solution. They also gave us best identity solution, but we couldn't be there without all of our advertiser partners. And so one thing that's really critical about the platform that we have is it's a full tech stack. And what I mean by that is we have an ad server, we have a DSP, we have dynamic creative optimization solutions, as well as in Europe, we have an SSP, as well as a DMP. And so that gives us a holistic view of the relationship of the digital spend that advertisers put out into the marketplace. What we'll get through a little bit, there's some use cases about how that helps brands actually grow. I think one thing that's really important is that, brands are often considered system integrators. They have to take all of these point solutions in place. And one of our goals is to try and consolidate that so they have more operational time back to marketing and less on the operational manipulation of the technology platforms itself. So with that, why don't we just jump right in and talk about our partnership?
Yeah, so really interesting story here. I'll never forget, it was, I think, May 25th, 2018, where we were working on a brand doing unified. Back then, about 4 or 5 years ago, oh my God, 5 years ago, unified was literally, we have a marketing mix modeling here and we have some attribution MTA models here, and how do we bring them together? And back then, I'll never forget, on that date, GDPR came into effect. And when that happened, there were major ad tech platforms in the European Union who essentially deprecated their data or sunset their data services. So we had to find a way to get robust, accurate, granular data to support the unified measurement that we were doing across the European Union, and really ran out of options until we met Adform, which was really at that point leveraging, at the beginning of this period, first-party data from the point of activation and for measurement. So we partnered together to really address some of the key industry changes that are still the driving force of what we're seeing today, with advertisers either having access to some of their data or some of their data not being accessible due to these changes. GDPR we talked about. There's a major need in the industry to move away from third-party cookies, and as we saw, in AdExchanger and many different pubs, Google is planning to deprecate their data service in 2023, similar to what's going on with other browsers. And privacy is absolutely critical. Being able to have privacy-enhanced technologies and being able to have consent-driven, compliant data that consumers can opt into is critical. We cannot be in a situation where we're looking at measurement data that violates any of these industry changes and where the future is headed in terms of ensuring we have a privacy-led environment. So this partnership that we built 4 or 5 years back was all about how do we future-proof attribution analytics, bringing together advertisers, ad tech, and the publishers really to ensure that data is compliant, that we're moving away from those third-party cookies into cookieless insights and embedded with consent management platforms. Now I know, John, a lot of work's been done over the past couple of years, and working with the data, your data, and being able to integrate it into our models, has been critical because we're continuously working together. Maybe you could speak a little bit about some of the things that are happening now from a privacy or from a first-party perspective that are really helping future-proof both the data from these perspectives as well as supporting us in our partnership on measurement.
Yeah, so for our American listeners who may not know, Adform was founded in Copenhagen and is probably the second largest DSP in Europe. So we've been coming from this presence, and we've also read in the trades how far advanced Europe is in pushing forth legislation to protect consumers. And with the GDPR compliance requirements they put forth, Adform had to first react for its European footprint to make sure that we were compliant in that context. This has obviously a massive benefit for what's going on in the States right now, because we're seeing that there's already 6 different states that have their own legislation that have already been passed. And there's another 21 states that are in the process of passing legislation as we speak. And so our fundamental goal is to make sure that no attorney generals are knocking on the doors of advertisers to say, hey, you know, you may not have picked your ad tech stack, but if you did, just make sure that it's compliant. And so we can put a huge check in the box that because of our European roots and also how we thought about how identity was going to change and the access that we have, we've purpose built around this to make sure that brands are protected moving forward.
And to speak to that, I know there's a lot of words here, but really we wanted to kind of talk about the current state of the industry. What changes have led ad tech and brands to not have full access to data? And how do we get to a point where there's more collaboration in the industry, more partnerships in the industry around data, around what data can be used for what reasons to drive insights, to drive activation? The explosion of data, you know, more data sources, programmatic, AI, everybody's talking about AI these days, and obviously privacy concerns led to some limitations, which we just talked about. You know, the rise of the walled gardens and really working with regulators from a privacy perspective. Where we are headed today is all about driving that first party relationship and bringing together ad tech, in our case, measurement firms with ad tech providers, to think about how to better be agile in our measurement, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also highly collaborative with advertisers. Advertising that collaboration in a way that's always evolving with the changes in the data ecosystem. There's actually a pretty funny story here. It was a couple of nights ago, I was in India, and John called me and he said, hey Rob, I went into ChatGPT and I entered in, who owns data these days? What do you think about data these days? And John, why don't you talk a little bit about what we learned from ChatGPT in terms of what the state looks like across these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're going to use artificial intelligence as our guide. And it's funny, I've been looking about the past of, how this whole AI came to be. And I came across a quote from Pablo Picasso in 1968, where he said, "Computers are useless. They only know the answers." And so I thought that was very telling, that we're in this state where we're looking to go and get answers. And to your point, I wanted to find out about, hey, are we onto something here? Is it only the two of us that are talking about that marketers need to be in control of more of their data? So to your point, I populated the question, who should own the relationship with the consumers and the data? Should it be the ad tech platforms, or should it be the advertisers? And it came up with 3 really salient buckets of information, right? And we don't have to read it here verbatim, but the control, by owning their data, advertisers have greater control how it's collected, transparency, which is critical, like how is it actually going back and forth between the two parties, and the quality of the data. So I think that ad tech has a role for making sure that it can get the data in a clean, salient component so it can get passed across, but we need to give that control back. And something that's really important on the last slide that I want to touch on is, if we look back over the past 25 years or so, we look at the changes that have happened, there's an expression out there that circles and surfaces every once in a while, that the internet eats its young. And what that means is that back in the day when we had AOL and its rise to its then, position top of the poll, we had Yahoo that came and ate its lunch, which was then followed by MySpace that came in. It's kind of this first social media, which then got eaten by Facebook. And then we had Snapchat came in, and then we had TikTok that came in. And so each one starts to get replaced. But while that's been happening, the walls have been being built by these respective players to go around their positioning. So there was a day in which this was all very open. But as soon as we started having ad tech players own media and the capacity to control the relationship with the consumers, we're starting to see advertisers being hurt because they can't see into the ecosystem of what's really happening with their brands. And obviously this affects reach and frequency, which are the core pinnacles of which is all the spend. So if we just to keep riffing on this, Robert, I think I think what's important about all this is if the walled gardens are going up and we have cookie deprecation, then what's the role of identity, or what's the role of consumer relationships with these brands? And so another famous expression, content is king, which by default has to make advertiser queen, to continue this metaphor, and thus making the consumer their offspring. And so this triptych relationship between the three is critical. In an advertising delivery ecosystem, to help brands understand what dollars are working, we need to have one view on all this identity, but that's not going to happen. It's super duper fragmented. So today, over 50% of the internet is already non-addressable, whether through cookie deprecation or whether they're looking through the internet lens using Safari or Firefox. But at the end of the day, there's not one ID provider that rules the roost. In effect, you can see here are some stats. Because Adform has an ad server and a DSP, we get to see a lot of different data points that come through the bid stream and through some of the other things that our advertisers share with us in a privacy compliant way. And no one ID provider has more than 15%. And there's a long tail with all of that. And so what's a marketer to do when it needs to continue with its effective frequency goals and its targeting goals, but they can't combine all of these things? And we'll talk a little bit more about how Adform is approaching that and how we're helping with the Ipsos understanding of through this multi-touch attribution. But this is staggering. And the net impact of all of this is there's probably only 60%, maybe even 50% of all of the marketplace that's being bid upon in the programmatic landscape, which leaves 40% up there for grabs. And that's where I think Adform really stands apart in helping brands in that context. So what we did was we said, hey, look, if nobody's going to win this identity war, then why don't we just stitch them all together? And so this notion of ID fusion, we call it the graph of graphs, is this notion that if we know that these respective players of LiveRamp and Neustar and ID5 all have their respective relationship with the consumer, and we can stitch these together in a privacy compliant way and bring in other signals, then we don't need cookies at this point anymore. We actually can see through all the different ID providers who has seen what on what device and cross device. And it's a very, very powerful way of helping brands get to that extra 40, 50% of those viewers that aren't being bid upon today because they don't have cookies. And through no fault of the agencies, a lot of the times they're being held to performance metrics, which you need a cookie. And so here we have a marketplace that needs to continue to focus on cookie-enabled environments, when at the end of the day, there's all these others that we really need to go after to increase our yield and understand our reach and frequency. So that was a lot for me, just to tee it up about how this goes through. But when we'll go into the next piece about how Ipsos is taking this forward and helping brands.
Sorry, my PowerPoint keeps going. But so I think a key point, John, on that, I don't know why this keeps happening. I think a key point that you mentioned and that we hold very, very dear in how we think about using the data that we partner on is being agnostic, right? So we're not glued to an ID or to some approach that's relying on, let's say, third-party cookies or using a ramp or a Neustar or an ID5. What's really critical, and I think you brought that very clearly through on the ID fusion piece, is having an agnostic approach not only allows us to increase our coverage, particularly from a measurement perspective, but also enables advertisers in terms of how they think about activation. So measurement across the open internet, and in some cases where we can get data access through different walled gardens, is critical, but it's super important to have that approach where you're really agnostic to all the changes that are happening in the industry. And speaking to that, measurement needs to be agnostic as well, and measurement needs to be multifaceted. There's not a single measurement approach that can solve everything. And we've learned that through the 5 years that we've been working together and previously with other case studies around other brands like Starbucks, where we realized You can't go all individual, or you can't, just look at certain cohorts or certain walled gardens or certain publishers to get the full picture. So the approach that we're taking in this partnership, as well as overall in terms of how we think about being agnostic to the ecosystem and the changing environment, is having an agile approach. There are lots of different ways to connect measurement and call it unified. Our approach is really about bringing together models in which the data, where that data is available and where that data is the most robust. And that idea, and that the Adform flow that we just talked about is one of those many ingredients. Some of these techniques are not impacted at all due to data deprecation. If we think about marketing mix modeling, there's really no impact, but marketing mix modeling is not providing real-time signals into activation platforms and really driving those decisions in the bid stream. Agile modeling, a lot of companies are thinking about how to become more agile. Our approach is, look, there's data out there at the buy level, at the placement level. Let's bring it all together and ensure that it's connected. It's connected and it's holistic in a way that we're still providing incrementality to our clients faster and more deeper in terms of the granularity of the insights. There's another layer called cohorts, and we work with many, many different publishers and advertising technology companies where we're doing closed loop, and that's very important as well. There are some data limitations there in terms of the ability to do cross-platform. Sorry about this. Just go back to here. But it's very important that we're still bringing in granular data to do closed loop measurement on audiences. Where we are today is, how do we improve individual level models in a way that's, again, agnostic and ensures coverage, independent of what the browsers are doing. And that's where we are today with Adform, is really building a sustainable approach in that unified framework at the individual level and is privacy safe. So individual models fueled by agnostic data sources that are going across all of the different ways to activate media channels is absolutely critical. Does it build a sustainable individual attribution? For the portion of the internet where we can do it, absolutely. Understanding that customer journey insight and the incrementality. Without these models, it's very tough to action on retargeting and building lookalikes and prospecting. And that's where we come together and build those connective tissues. So, from an Adform perspective and leveraging their DSP as well as other DSPs, we're able to provide feeds into the AdTech environment on behalf of our advertisers to drive first-party relationships from an advertising standpoint. That means retargeting. That means driving prospecting to those high-value audiences, getting granular. So really understanding reach and frequency and overlap. Those are the major ingredients to really optimizing your plans in the open web, right? So individual data giving us the option to look at what are the next best actions? How do I think about my next best offer? And importantly, and what we've established here with Adform is how do we integrate with platforms in a way that the analytics can fuel those next best actions, can fuel which customers or potential customers have the highest probability to convert, and then go after them based on the ID or the agnostic of covering as much as we can within the open web. And we have a couple of cases that we can share on this.
Well,
I don't know if
can I just weigh in on that? There's some digital back slide, because I think that's what's really important here is that brands always have to speak in two notions of metrics, right? You have media metrics and then you have business outcomes. And brands can't share the business outcomes and the relationship of that media metric, an impression or a click or a CPM, to a business outcome, because obviously the sell side will get a better understanding of what's actually driving that performance, and they'll increase their rates. And so for decades, we've had a notion of impressions, and impressions correlate to outcomes in that context. And for too long, or only in very few medias, there's been opportunity to actually take that full circle and optimize it on real time, right? For nobody's fault, we're just getting better access to the data as we've been talking about here, and we can actually have stronger partnerships as we're also talking about here. But that relationship between media metrics and business outcomes is what's going to drive the future of all of what the space in which we work. Because I bet that there's media players out there that would consider selling on business outcomes if they had a shared ecosystem. That's up to the brand to decide where that's going to go, right? So this is a whole nother topic of conversation about, can agencies be compensated on their performance of outcomes, or is it just on making sure they get the best cost for the media? So as this model continues to play out, we got to get the brands smarter about, well, what is the relationship between these impressions in the digital ecosystem to my outcomes? Against what audience segment? Oh, when I run out of one audience segment because I feel like I saturated them with enough and they bought my product, what is the next audience segment and the relationship to my product development that's actually going to pop? So I think that this component right here about continually optimizing around the 360 view, this is clearly where the industry is going.
And completely to back that up is an example here that we've done with a financial services company. First of all, bringing data front and foremost was critical, and understanding at a log level with those first party data spines, how do we analyze it in a way that, to your point exactly, how do we eliminate waste, right? Without even doing a model, you can see that you're hitting the same customer or the same prospect across multiple DSPs or through multiple partners, and really not getting an understanding of how that overlap translates to frequency, and how that frequency, at what point does that frequency to convert, drive a conversion. So through this, data and through the models, we're able to, number one, tie simple media metrics to exposures and to actions to business outcomes. And I think business outcomes is absolutely critical. So, building that first party element across all of the AdTech ecosystem to really bring in integrations, bring in the marketing mix models and the agile models to ensure it's all incrementality. We're not assuming every single touch point, whether it's an exposure or a click, gets 100% credit, to business outcome is also very important. So bringing together all of these elements allowed us to deploy an environment which is third-party cookieless, right? Agnostic, third-party cookieless, and analyzing attribution models connected to incrementality, connected to those business outcomes, generated a massive increase in sales for this financial service company. Within a quarter, 31% increase. Number one, just because we were able to measure and buy in cookie-limited environments. And examples here are Safari and Firefox. Number two was to ensure that the data was first party. There were first party relationships in how that data was collected. And number three, as attribution models were built, again, governed by that marketing mix framework, that holistic framework, the commercial framework, we were able to feed data back into Adform's DSP. And that's important because a lot of what we see in the industry is there's a lack of incrementality, right? They're sending data scores, this is the credit drive, and potentially, if you don't have that incrementality view, you're going to activate audiences that may have converted anyway, or deliver against audiences, or deliver within certain partners among customers that may not convert. So really understanding the incrementality view and how it connects to the business outcomes through models is really where the industry needs to be and head. But the data spine is the critical piece, that data spine around moving away from third-party cookie reliance, moving towards cookieless environments, or through first-party relationships, and bringing that graph of graphs together so that coverage and projectability is maximized in terms of the quality of the analytics.
I really can't add any more to that. I think that really is what we're all doing here. I think if we look back into the history books, that AdTech has gotten a little too big for its britches. And I think it's time for marketers to, consolidate it and maybe in a non-flippant way, come up with their own Bill of Rights. I think that marketers are the fuel of the industry. I'm a service company. We're servicing brands to do more with less. And if you can't get your hands on that data, you can't do more with less. And so at some point in tandem, of course, the government's not going to handle any of this. It's up to the brands themselves. And I know the ANA has done a lot of work to try and push this ball forward, and a lot of good work in that context. And we need to continue to have all of the efforts around transparency. One thing that Adform stands for is transparency. We've had PwC audit all of our pipes, including all of our financials and how we price. These are the types of things that we need to move this business forward, because there's too much low-hanging fruit that's being wasted by not being able to A, optimize, B, get access to the data. So without access to the data, we can't really get started. So this notion will be put out there, and Robert and I are going to be on a panel at the Possible Conference in a couple of weeks in Miami. Ping us if anybody wants to go. It's going to be a great conference. And so you got a sneak peek at this. The notion and the importance of aggregating all this, I think, is what many people on this call can bring up and start to consolidate their power accordingly.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's a very exciting time. In working with a lot of brands here at Ipsos MMA, what we've learned is a couple of things. Collaboration, a collaborative approach is ideal. There's no notion anymore, given the dynamics of the industry and how fast things are changing, that there's a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, it's gone. There's no more top-down, bottom-up, and you have a model. It's really about the data strategy mapped to the business outcomes and the layers of analytics that will answer the business questions down to the most granular, actionable source possible. And that feeds into agility, right? Models today need to have some level of agility translated into incrementality, meaning that given the changes, and I wake up every morning and I read Ad Exchange and I'm thinking, and I call John, oh, now what's changing, and how do we have to think about data and models, to ensure that we're ahead of the curve so that advertisers have that transparency into what's changing and how models are always adopting. So, when we think about a Bill of Rights, it's about how to collaborate across the ecosystem from an ad tech advertiser perspective to connect the dots in a way that's fully collaborative and transparent. So I don't know if there's any additional thoughts or questions. We do have some questions in the answer box, so thank you for those who have submitted it. John, would it be okay if I threw a couple to you?
Please.
Awesome. So I think there's one there that I can grab and one that you can grab. I think an interesting one that just came up was, what do you think the role of ad tech needs to be in terms of working with advertisers to provide the resources required to stay ahead of the industry?
So, I mean, in the 50s, when the Eisenhower administration said we need highways to connect everybody, the next step was we had standards, because they had the size of the road that was the right size, so they could build the trucks that were the right size, which means brands could start packaging things in the right shape. And then you have the container industry take off, so that we could actually, like the quick service restaurant category took off, because you could get things to local places, and then we had national advertising. So why do I use that metaphor? AdTech is responsible for delivering things, for counting things, and for measuring things. Some of us are MRC accredited to make sure that we're being counted properly, we count properly, but at the same time, brands have the best understanding of their relationship, of their product development, what they're building, and who's going to buy it, right? I'm not so sure that AdTech has a relationship to actually own that. relationship, but more to help you understand where you can find more of it. And that's obviously access to data. Secondly, AdTech generally is a point solutions game. And as I mentioned earlier, brands are too often considered system integrators. They can't be system integrators, right? They have other things. They're building sneakers. So we need to help brands consolidate the number of platforms that they have. So the data needs to flow more quickly between those platforms so they can move faster, because life is not going to slow down. So access to data, building the roads so that you decide what you want to put into the trucks and then therefore own that sequential relationship.
And I have a question here. That was great, John. And I have a question here. How would the success rate be measured? That's a great question. And our leadership here, Pat and Doug and the team here, John, we talk about that a lot. And it all comes down to business outcomes in the form of incrementality. And I know that's easy to say, but at the end of the day, what we have to think about is through our models, through the data that supports that models and the validation of that data, how do we simulate changes that potentially would happen without making implementations and changes to your media plans. So comparing a simulated result, a status quo, a business as usual, to an optimized plan at the level in which this data is available is critical, because what that does is it says, well, a model is a model. The model could fit perfectly, and that's great. You know, we can bring that to any CMO and they will pat each other on the back. But when you actually say, well, this is what you are going to do, based on the data and the models, this is what you should do, and what's the lift, and how does that lift translate into business outcomes, into profitability, is essentially how we think about success rate. When I have my weekly calls with John here and we go through the collaborations we're working on, the first question that we go through is, well, what was done this week based on our recommendations, and essentially what was the lift? What was the incrementality that we saw across our clients? Because ultimately, that's what we want to be tied to in terms of success. There's a lot of metrics here. There's a lot of ingredients, but all those tactical metrics, they roll into marketing outcomes, which eventually roll into business outcomes. And the models are the ones that connect all of that together. So Ellen, I think we're at time, unless there's any other questions from the team. I don't see any more on the chat box. Actually, there are a couple more. How is that? Okay. I have one for you, John. Can you speak to Adform's unique position in identity? Given all of the identities across the ecosystem.
Right. So Adform doesn't have its own unique identifier. We took a different zig while everybody was zagging. Instead, ID Fusion takes a holistic view of all the other IDs that are in the market, because we have an ad server and we also have a DSP. We can see the bid stream and we can start to correlate who has multiple IDs on a first-party ID, so that we have a comprehensive view in a cookieless environment. So I would say our uniqueness is that today, 98% of the brands are bidding on 60% of the marketplace. And out of the gate, we can deliver that other 40% of the marketplace that most brands are missing today. And so probably because, and what we've seen, that's probably around 30% less cost, because nobody's bidding on it. So there's immediate benefits out of the gate just by understanding how to reach people in cookieless environments, which we do out of the gate.
Awesome. So there are a few more questions. We will send you all responses via email. Wanted to thank you for your time today. This was a very great discussion. Thank you, John, for joining us today.
Sure.
Ellen, any closing remarks that you may have, but thank you everybody for dialing in.
Thank you.
Wow, I really want to just echo my thanks and to everyone joining us, but especially John and Robert for this really engaging conversation. For everyone, please be on the lookout for an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation. That should be coming sometime this week. And at any time, please reach out to us directly. We'd love to connect with you. That now concludes today's Ipsos webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye. Take care.